Well, the United States government just passed $1.7 trillion spending package as this bill made it through the House and then the Senate, and President Biden signed it into law. Biden signed this while vacationing on the Caribbean island of St. Croix. Now, I've long been an advocate for politicians taking vacations. In fact, I've stated before that I think our country would be much better off if the only thing politicians were paid for was to do absolutely nothing, because at least they can't screw the country up. But I didn't take into account that they could do both at the same time. They could sign into law a giant spending package while on vacation in their Caribbean islands. So the question is, what is in this $1.7 trillion bill? And the answer is nobody knows. Because this bill happens to be more than 4,000 pages long, which means none of the people who voted for it, or against it for that matter, had a chance to even read it to see what they were voting for. But I am here for you, and I have read through every single one of these pages so I can explain to you exactly what is in this bill. Just kidding, of course I did not read through these 4,000 pages. Nobody should be required to read through these 4,000 pages. Unless, of course, you're going to be voting on it for the entire country. But we do have some bullet points. We know where roughly the majority of this money is going to be going. Number one, we've got about $45 billion going to more aid for Ukraine. This is going to be things like training and weapons and logistics support and salaries. And about $12 billion will be used to replenish US stocks of equipment. In addition to the money being sent to Ukraine, we also have some money that is going to be spent on emergency disaster relief, about $38 billion to help farmers, people who have been hit by tornadoes, hurricanes, flooding, and fires. We've got a provision included that makes it harder to overturn a certified election, money to fund January 6th prosecutions, a ban on using TikTok on federal devices, and protections for pregnant workers, such as additional bathroom breaks, stools to sit on, or relief from lifting heavy objects. It's just really great to see the United States government taking all this money and spending it in a way that's going to improve the economy and help growth and help out the American people instead of being more of a burden on our American households' backs. And people tell me I need to work on my sarcasm, so FYI, that was sarcasm. All in all, this budget represents a massive increase in spending for the federal government above and beyond what was projected for 2023. In fact, it was $58 billion higher, with more than 75% of the increase going to defense spending. The increase is more than the adjustment necessary for inflation, and it represents a real increase of about 3%. Now, the question that many people have, and we're already seeing many people disagree on, is whether or not this spending will be inflationary, deflationary, or somewhere in between. And the answer is follow the money. It always depends on the money supply. Take, for instance, this example. If I borrow $100 from you, that means you now do not have that $100 to spend. So when I spend that $100 that I get from you, there is no increase in the money supply happening. I'm simply taking the money that you could have spent and I'm spending it instead. And then when I go to pay you back, I need to take from my income and give you that money back. And now that's $100 that I can no longer spend because I'm giving it back to you. So when the government spends money and it's funded purely by taxes and purely by borrowing, the net effect is not inflationary or deflationary. It's simply transfer spending. It's taking money from lenders, people who buy US treasuries, and from taxpayers, and it's spending that in a different way than those people would have spent that money themselves. Now we'll go through all the details, but keep in mind every time I'm talking about any little part of this, it is ceteris paribus. That means all else being equal. So if everything else stays the same, which we know it doesn't, but I'll cover those details. If everything else stays the same, then transfer spending is not inflationary or deflationary inherently. It's taking money from one person's ability to purchase something with it and spending it somewhere else instead. Now at this moment, you're probably thinking, but wait a second, taxes and borrowing are legally the only sources of income that a government has. So how could it possibly ever be inflationary if that's the case? And the answer is not directly, but indirectly, that borrowing can come from the Federal Reserve. That borrowing can be an increase in the money supply. That's what happened during 2020 and 2021, is that all the money that the government spent was created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve and loaned to the federal government. And so the net result of that was a large increase in the total supply of money circulating around. They weren't just taking $1 from here and spending it over there. They were taking new dollars and injecting them into the system. That new money bid prices up and caused inflation. So the answer to whether this spending will be inflationary or deflationary depends on how long the Federal Reserve sticks to quantitative tightening. Right now, they're not creating new money out of thin air to give to the government for spending. They're actually decreasing the money supply. They're letting assets bleed off their balance sheet, which is why when we look at M2, the measure of the money supply, we've seen that for over a year now, the money supply has been slowly decreasing. In November of 2021, the money supply was 21.38 trillion, and now it's 21.37 trillion. And it's been on the decline since it peaked in April of 2022. So the spending by itself is neither inflationary or deflationary. It depends on the source of the money. If it comes just from borrowers and taxpayers, which is where it looks like it's coming from right now, it would not be inflationary or deflationary by itself. It'll only turn inflationary if it ends up getting funded by the Federal Reserve through money printing. But now we have to talk about the second piece of this, which is what I mentioned earlier, all else being equal, because we know that the size of the economy has something to do with inflation and deflation as well. For instance, imagine that every single TV just magically turned into 10 TVs. And so whatever the type of TV was, whether it was an OLED or a LCD or something else, suddenly there were 10 of them. The abundance of TVs that suddenly sprang into existence would cause them to drop in price because there are so many more of them that you might want one or two extra, but maybe you don't have room for all 10. So you might want to sell those along with a lot of other people that would also be trying to sell them to make a quick buck. But because there's so many of them, it becomes much easier to get your hands on new TVs, and so the demand for them is much lower. And so instead of being able to sell them at their original price of, let's say, $1,000, now you can only sell them at maybe $100. This is an example of what abundance or the supply of something does to its price. And so if the economy grows rapidly, we have a massive increase in real goods and services of all things, not just TVs, then all things get cheaper. When we have more cars, more houses, more food, more clothing, more shelter, that means that those things get cheaper because they're more abundant and more easily accessible. So hypothetically speaking, if all of these $1.7 trillion that the government is spending goes to spending on things that will increase productivity, increase the amount of wealth people have, increase the amount of stuff there is in the economy, availability and abundance of things for people to buy. If it makes food more abundant, if it makes shelter more abundant, if it makes clothing more abundant, if it makes cars more abundant, then the natural result of this would be deflation. It would mean things get cheaper. But we also know that that is rarely what happens with government spending. In fact, just a very, very big piece of this, military spending, is on net destructive. You're diverting resources into things like bullets and ammunition and missiles and equipment like tanks, and you're sending it off overseas literally to be destroyed. So you're taking resources that are already scarce and removing them from the ability to be used for other things. Not to mention all the other funding for things that are not directly related whatsoever to increasing productive output, then we can make a guess that this would actually have the effect of pushing prices up because it's wasting resources. It makes things less abundant, more scarce. So again, with all of this, you always have to keep in mind the explanation of the mechanics of how these things work is ceteris paribus, all else being equal. So while the net effects of just the spending because of the destructive aspects of misallocation of resources and the destruction of capital that goes into a lot of government spending, you also have to consider what private actors are doing by themselves. And will that be enough to offset what everybody else does, just ignoring the government? So while it's impossible to say for certainty right now whether this $1.7 trillion they're spending will cause the inflation numbers to go up or cause the inflation numbers to go down, one thing is certain, that we're definitely moving in the wrong direction here. More government spending is helpful for nobody except the people that actually receive the money from the government, which is why they vote for it in the first place. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.